In Germany Possessed, H.G. Baynes, an analytical psychologist steeped in Jungian thought, presents a arresting thesis that Nazi Germany was not merely a political state, but a psychic entity overwhelmed by subterranean mythic forces. Baynes argues that the German mind had been possessed by a demonic energy, with Adolf Hitler serving not as the originator of those forces, but as the medium through which they surged into history. This interpretive framework reframes the rise of Nazism as an architectural eruption, expressed through myth, collective delirium, and ritualized power. Baynes situates this idea within a broader epochal transition, in which the tension between pagan myth and Christian individualism comes to a critical breakpoint. The pagan-Christian conflict in the European spirit, especially potent in Germany, gave way to a state of collective intoxication where individuality was eclipsed by collective possession. By weaving in the symbolism of Wotan, the wild Germanic god archetype, Baynes and other thinkers illuminate how myth reawakes in times of crisis, and how leaders can become conduits for larger psychic movements. This video examines Baynes' theory through several lenses, diagnosing possession of the national psyche, interpreting Hitler as a shamanic medium, analyzing the reanimation of pagan myth via Wotan, exploring the suppressed Christian order and its limits, and considering modern echoes and critical assessments. Throughout, the focus remains analytical and richly contextual. Baynes' foundational premise is that Germany's collective unconscious had become psychically unstable. He writes that the nation was afflicted by a demonic outbreak, a metaphorical possession in psychological terms. Rather than interpreting Nazism solely as political upheaval, Baynes sees it as the eruption of long-suppressed mythic energy, too powerful for rational structures to contain. This psychic state emerges as a negation of individuality, rooted in layers of myth and trauma. Germany's deep dissatisfaction after World War I, combined with spiritual dislocation and a crisis of identity, created fertile ground for myth punk, collective regression into archaic psychic forces. Baynes gestures towards how mythology and legend became mass experiences, not just cultural artifacts, but psychic currencies exchanged in the public unconscious. In Baynes' analysis, Hitler emerges not as the possessor, but as the medium, a primitive medicine man who becomes the vessel through which Germany's psychic eruption finds expression. He embodies the split German soul, both symptom and symptom, leader, myth, and ailment interwoven. Baynes describes Hitler's personality as ambiguous and magnetic, both disease and symbol. This ambivalence allows him to absorb the nation's psychic instability and channel it into a coherent narrative of identity and destiny. Symbolically, Hitler functions like an ancient oracle. He does not generate the spirit, but he articulates and amplifies it. Through ritual, speech, and imagery, he gives collective trance a direction and a purpose. The chapter titled Wotan, God and the Daemon deepens Baynes' theorization by invoking the mythic figure of Wotan, the ancient Germanic storm god, as an operative archetype in the German soul. Wotan represents wildness, trance, prophetic fury, and the dissolution of rational bounds, as well as foundational knowledge. Carl Jung's essay Wotan from 1936 resonates powerfully here. Jung argued that the Nazi movement reignited this archetype. Germany's descent into mass hypnosis mirrored Wotan's wild hunt, a frenzied storm unleashed by psychic energy. In Jung's view, Hitler became the one who seizes, while the nation remained the seized. This dynamic reflects possession on a psychic scale, myth infecting mass consciousness, driving emotional and ethical eclipse. Baynes integrates this potent myth into his theory. Wotan symbolizes Germany's regression, a return to archaic psychic patterns dormant beneath Christian rationality. In times of crisis, ancient gods can be awakened as metaphors of forces driving political upheaval. Baynes places Germany's psychic state within a pagan Christian conflict. He sees European Christianity as urging individuality through moral autonomy. But Germany's soul, he argues, collapsed into collective trance, rejecting that autonomy. The pagan remnants, Wotanian myth, warrior cults, romantic nationalism, surfaced not as a quaint nostalgia, but as a collective intoxication, overpowering conscience. In Baynes' symbolic anthropology, the Christian ethic has contained the mythic past, but its collapse opened the floodgates to ancestral madness. Germany's historical predisposition toward mythic identity, combined with social trauma, produced not liberation, but possession. Baynes frames the possession of Germany as emblematic of an epochal psychological transition. He interprets Nazism not simply as a political aberration, but as a civilizational symptom, the breakdown of modern order under mythic resurgence. This crisis marks a moment in which rational, individual-centered morality failed to contain mass unconscious forces. In Baynes' view, Hitlerism exemplified this failure. Modern technology and myth fused into a destructive collective trance. The crisis became self-perpetuating, accelerated by symbolic immersion, mass mobilization, and emotional abandonment. While Baynes does not explicitly address occultism, the reactivation of myth through ritual, symbols, and cultic pageantry in Nazi Germany bridges closely with occult theory. Pan-German myth, Wagnerian symbolism, grand rallies, SS mythologizing, and occult-inspired fantasies of destiny provided the cultural soil for psychic possession. Historians like Nicholas Goodrick-Clarke trace how Ariosophy and mystical German nationalism contributed esoteric archetypes to the Nazi project. Though Baynes remains psychological in his interpretation, the reawakening of Wotan is functionally linked to these occult influences, for he sees myth as psychologically potent rather than spiritually neutral. Baynes's interpretation opens rich analytical terrain. It expresses the emotional, mythic, and unconscious dimensions often neglected in socio-political histories. His psychological archetype model illuminates Hitler's charisma and Germany's readiness for totalitarian trance. However, skeptics might note that framing Nazism as possession risks minimizing agency and ideological structure. The metaphor of possession can obscure rational economic factors, political strategies, and institutional complicity. And additionally, the mystical dimension may seem less anchored in verifiable social dynamics. Nevertheless, Baynes himself acknowledges the metaphorical nature of his frame. It is a psychological lens, not a replacement for political history. The model is heuristic, not ontological. Baynes's theory remains strikingly relevant today, especially amid resurging populism and identity-driven politics. Social media, emotive narratives, and charismatic figureheads all echo the dynamics Baynes analyzed. Wotan's archetype can be seen in contemporary phenomena where mythic identity moments or symbolic leaders evoke collective trance. The interplay between narrative emotion and belief remains central. When societies experience alienation or crisis, myth, ancient or fabricated, can reassert itself, and charismatic figures may surface as symbolic conduits. Baynes's commentary thus serves as a caution that the breakdown of individual rationality can permit myth to dominate. H.G. Baynes's Germany Possessed offers a rare and profound lens through which to view history, not as a chain of events, but as psychic currents unleashed by mythic possession. His model of a national possession, Hitler as medium, and Wotan as archetypal spirit, reveals how collective psychology can shape events with uncanny force. Baynes's work encourages an interdisciplinary approach, blending psychology, mythology, history, and cultural symbolism to understand how myth and leadership merge into epochal transformation. His thesis neither excuses nor denounces, but seeks instead an explanation. In reflecting on his ideas, we confront uncomfortable truths, that myth may lie dormant in us all, and that social hardship, coupled with symbolic rupture, can awaken archetypes powerful enough to eclipse ethics. Baynes challenges us to cultivate conscious cultural frameworks to prevent the re-emergence of possession in any guise.